I'm Natalie Baker. So I'll just say a little bit about myself, just so you have some sense of my background, and then we'll launch into people's questions. Um, so I am by training a psychotherapist. I have been in private practice in New York for about 20 years. And about 10 years ago, I'm also a longtime meditator and meditation teacher. And about 10 years ago, one of my meditation students asked me if I'd heard of neurofeedback, that this was this new technology that could, really help people, the brain patterns connected with all sorts of things. And I hadn't heard of it, so it piqued my curiosity, having a practice with lots of people with post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety and depression. I was always looking for tools that I thought could help my client base. So that started me looking into the wonderful world of what back then seemed like Frankenstein technology of hooking people up to wires and reading their brain waves. So I did neurofeedback on myself. I decided I was going to start with the NeurOptimal system because I spoke to a bunch of psychotherapists like myself who had ventured into the world of neurofeedback. And they had had really good experiences with NeurOptimal. And because it was a fully automated system, so I wasn't going to need to go back to school and learn, how to tweak people's brains. I thought this was a good system for me and for the work that I did. And I also really liked the fact that people could take it home and train at home. So that made it also a less expensive price point for my clients potentially. So that also piqued my curiosity. So anyway, I went off and did the NeurOptimal neurofeedback on myself. I sent a couple of my pretty traumatized, complex PTSD clients to go and try it. And, we all had good enough results that I thought, okay, I should really, bring this into my practice, for the benefit of my clients. So that was about 10 years ago. And I started to offer people rentals as an alternative to doing the neurofeedback at home, because there were lots of people who then wanted to train their family members. So one thing led to another. And 10 years later, we have a national rental program. Sarah, who is a part of my team, who runs the West Coast rental and in-office sessions, she's on the call here to help us facilitate. And a couple of years ago, I became a sales representative for NeurOptimal to help psychotherapists who are interested in exploring this technology to help them along the path. So today's webinar is really an opportunity for anybody to ask any questions they have about neurofeedback, about NeurOptimal specifically, and I will do my best to answer. It's an important question for a lot of people, because people with chronic illness are a population that are very interested in neurofeedback. I wish that there was a simple answer to that question, but I'm gonna start out a little bit bigger, and then talk specifically about chronic illness and what does it mean to train too much, or how frequently should one train. So the NeurOptimal system is the sort of what I call the second generation of neurofeedback. So the first generation of neurofeedback started out when computer technology was pretty clunky. And so the ability of our ability to capture and feedback to the brain its brainwave patterns is very much dependent on computer speed. So in the early days of neurofeedback, computer technology was not as fast as how quickly the brain is changing states. So milliseconds, the brain is operating in terms of state change. So in the beginning, during the early years of neurofeedback, you had an external trainer who would set protocols, taking either a diagnosis or a brain map and seeing what the individual's brain, how it was stuck in maladaptive patterns. So just for those of you who, are kind of new to, the brain functioning. So the brain's communicating electrically and chemically. So neurofeedback is looking specifically at the electrical communication of the brain. And one of the things we understand, and only in recent decades do we understand this about mental health, is that it's not just a mind problem, it's also a brain habituation problem. So when we talk about anxiety, we're also talking about the brain being habituated to certain brainwave patterns that it does habitually that are not appropriate for the here and now. And so what neurofeedback's trying to address is specifically that electrical habituation of the brain that produces the symptoms that aren't helpful, that we don't want. And so what we're doing with neurofeedback is we're tracking the electrical activity, the electrical communication of the brain. And we do that through putting EEG sensors on the sides of the head. And protocol-based systems, they have more sensors than the NeurOptimal system, but that's a kind of, I don't want to deviate into the setup of different technologies. But the way the technology works is it's capturing that electrical activity, and then it's sending it into some sort of amplifier that changes that electricity into numbers. And then those numbers go into some sort of software. And in the early days of neurofeedback, because the ability to give real-time feedback to the brain wasn't possible because we didn't have home computing systems that were fast enough, you had the external trainer setting protocols to sort of nudge the brain out of those brainwave patterns that were thought to be causing the symptoms and migrate that system. So you can kind of think of it as like operant conditioning taking place. We're trying to teach the brain to do these kind of brain waves. So calm brain waves, if it's in hyperactive brain waves habitually, right? So that it can function more like a normal brain. So what happened with the second generation of neurofeedback, which is the NeurOptimal system, is that Dr. Brown, who was one of the co-creators of NeurOptimal, he could see back in the early days of neurofeedback where everybody was sort of nudging the brain out and into different brainwave patterns, that he could see that at some point computer technology was going to be fast enough that you could take out the middle person, right? The person setting the protocols, the trainer, and that you could create a system that was actually giving real-time feedback to the individual brain, that individual brain would see and use and self-correct. So this is part of the NeurOptimal system, is understanding that the brain will actually correct itself, but what it needs is good information in the present moment. So that's what the NeurOptimal system is doing. It's purely a feedback system. And whenever the brain is going into a state change and doing something, it creates a kind of electrical dance. So when those electrical sensors on the side of the head, when they pick up through the electrical impulse being changed into numbers, right? And the software is looking for the numbers that signify state change. In that millisecond, there is music that's playing in the program. And right then, there's an interruption in the music. So then, of course, the next question is, why is it significant to interrupt music? How is that creating transformation, of my anxiety? So as animals, we use auditory sense perception as a way to orient ourselves in our environment all the time. And the reason we use auditory is because we can listen even when we're asleep. So auditory in terms of registering changes in the environment and being able to stay safe, right? Detect danger, auditory sense perception is the best. So we're sending the brain through its natural orienting response, right? Interruptions in the music, and through that interruption, the brain notices something. It's like a call to pay attention. And in that milliseconds, it notices two events: what it's doing habitually or what it's about to do habitually, and then also what's happening in the present moment. And so when the brain sees that what it's doing habitually is not in alignment with the here and now, right? So anxiety is part of the stress response. The stress response the brain is supposed to do when it's in danger. If we see, oh, I'm in a safe environment, but I'm also about to go into hyperarousal, a stress response, why am I doing that, right? The brain is going to naturally want to shift out of that and into a state that's in alignment with the here and now. And so what happens during a neurooptimal session is the brain is given this feedback millisecond by millisecond. And so there's like corrections happening during a session, but then there's also the bigger picture change, which is that we're actually wanting the brain to learn something. So this system is actually a, hey brain, I want you to learn how to function in a more efficient and effective way. That's actually what we're providing the brain. And so what the brain ideally learns over a series of training sessions is how to get the good information to make efficient and effective decisions. So then the brain starts to do this even when it's not hooked up to the neurofeedback system. So now going back to Sophie's question about, well, if I have chronic illness, can I train every day? So again, well, what is the neurofeedback system doing? Well, it's actually just like presenting a mirror so the brain can see over and over again what it's doing. So typically what happens is if the brain is tired, right? If we're tired, we ignore something. So that's sort of the extent of what happens if we're quote unquote overtraining, is the brain is just going to ignore the feedback. It's like, I don't want to do it anymore. So there's no such thing when you're using the neurooptimal system of like overtraining the nervous system, because again, we're just alerting it to pay attention, and the brain will decide whether or not it wants to do anything with that information. Now, chronic illness then leads us into the next part, which is the, gosh, I wish I could give you a simple answer to this, which is that we're the only thing neurooptimal is doing is it's giving the brain the opportunity to see clearly pieces of information we want it to see, so it can then use that to change itself. So then it's like, well, what does the brain need to change itself, right? So that now we're on the topic of what gets in the way. So chronic illness, if we have underlying conditions that are preventing the brain, right? It's like gravity. So Dr. Brown will often use this analogy. It's like gravity. The brain is designed to use its energy efficiently and effectively. So the brain is going to want to improve itself when it gets the feedback from NeurOptimal. So then the question is, well, what would get in the way of that? Well, with chronic illness, right, where we have sort of mystery factors that are affecting our ability to function fully, right, that can get in the way because, you know, the brain needs certain things in order to be able to function at its best, right? So if you have gut issues, right, and one of the things we've learned, which is so cool, right, that if you have gut issues, you can have mood issues, right? Neurotransmitters are produced in the gut that help the brain function. So if there's something wrong with our gut and we're not producing neurotransmitters, okay, well that chemical piece that the brain needs might be missing. So when people have chronic illness, when they ask me, well, what can NeurOptimal do for me, is I always come back to the stress response. Because whenever we have chronic illness, we tend to also have some degree of stress. And so to whatever extent the brain can come out of the stress response, the brain will. So that in and of itself is a huge support, because we know that the stress response and chronic stress amplifies, whatever underlying conditions we also have, because it negatively impacts immune functioning. And why is neurofeedback so good for the stress response? Because the stress response is supposed to be what the brain does in imminent danger. So less than a minute, there's going to be bodily harm to this being. I should rev up or shut the system down, so go into hyperarousal or hypoarousal, fight, flight, or freeze, to respond immediately to the danger and then come out of it and go back into regulation. So that's what chronic anxiety and depression are. They're the brain thinking there's danger all the time when there actually isn't. So when the brain gets the opportunity from the neurofeedback to see it's safe, there is no imminent danger, it will naturally want to correct that stress response. So any chronic illness that has some degree of stress connected to it, NeurOptimal can support. How often should you train? You can train daily. But what I say to people is listen to your body, because one of the things that happens is the lines of communication between the brain, sort of unconscious, automatic functioning brain, which is really the part we're training, and the prefrontal cortex, conscious brain part, is that line of communication becomes clearer. So I always say to people, listen to your body. If you feel like, no, I don't want to have a session today, trust that instinct and maybe pass on having a session. But you can't overtrain, because remember, the brain will just ignore the feedback if it's tired and doesn't want to listen to it. I was just chatting with a nurse practitioner who uses NeurOptimal, and she said regarding the headache, she's like, dehydration. She said that's the thing that she sees the most that comes out for people, is they're not drinking enough water, and that's what's producing their headaches. So I thought that was really interesting. But again, NeurOptimal doesn't produce headaches because, again, we're not adding anything to the system. But what does happen is awareness happens. Remember what I just said about going more the line of communication. Because remember, if the unconscious, that automatic functioning brain, can send a clearer message to our conscious selves, then we are more likely to go out there and do the things that the brain needs to function optimally. So one of the really common things that happens with New Yorkers when they do a neurofeedback session is they come out and they go, oh my God, I'm exhausted. That thing made me exhausted. And then I say to them, how much sleep do you get a night? Oh, well, I get, somewhere around 5 hours of sleep a night. And I say, no, your system is showing you, I'm exhausted, please sleep more, right? So one of the things that I love about NeurOptimal is it's like shining a light, right? Because we're a system that needs all sorts of things to function optimally, right? So throw out the idea that there's like a one pill wonder, right? But to appreciate that optimal functioning of the brain includes like whole food diet, right? Minimal sugar and alcohol if we can do that, proper sleep, exercise, laughter, right? Time in nature, healthy relationships, right? All of those things help the brain. So the brain is going to start to ask for the things, the other things that it needs. Two biggest areas that have been researched with neurofeedback are ADD, ADHD, and PTSD. And the ADD, ADHD is because, parents really don't want to put their kids on stimulants as a first pass, right, of helping their kids out. They're like, really? Is this the only thing that we can do for our kids to help their brains recognize they're doing the wrong thing in the present moment? So NeurOptimal is a really very helpful support for kids whose brains are stuck in that, kind of scanning, right, when it really needs to be focusing energy. And so most kids do really well with like 2 or 3 months of training multiple times a week, like 2, 3, 4 times a week. The biggest challenge is getting to yes. So I would say the biggest obstacle is actually getting the kids on the system doing their sessions. And so the thing I always say to parents is make it a reward. So let them play on a separate device with the volume off, or play a game with them. And, they can be moving around so long as, their sensors are relatively stuck to their heads, and it's good to just check on them periodically. But to really just make it something that kids will agree to. And I would say that that's really the biggest obstacle. And then the cofactor that I see the most is poor diet. So here's a kind of an example from a couple of years ago, which is we had a mom who was training her son, and she was like, I'm not seeing any changes. And that's usually when we put our detective hat on. And the first thing with kids that we tend to talk about is diet. So what is he eating? Well, it turns out most of his diet was fast food, heavily processed foods. And so to her credit, when we said, hey, could you do an experiment for a couple of weeks and take him off fast food and prepare his meals for him and not let him have like really minimal sugar? And she did it. And when she changed his diet, poof, we saw the changes. So, a poor diet can mask being able to see what the neurofeedback is doing in kids. Also, allergies, food allergies is another really common sort of cofactor in ADHD symptoms. But typically we don't have to address those unless the parent comes to us and says, I'm not seeing any changes. And that's when we kind of do a deeper dive into what else might be going on. Well, that's when we have to start exploring what are the potential other factors that are going on, either health-wise or lifestyle-wise, that would be getting in the way. So this is often, if someone is really seeing no changes and they've been training for a couple of months, then I'd be like, okay, there's clearly something going on here. And that's often when I encourage people to go and see a functional doctor or a holistic doctor who can do a really good blood panel to see like what's happening with vitamin D, what's happening with B levels. And depending on, where the sort of symptoms are, I might send them in different directions. But if someone is kind of has like mood issues, for example, that would be my next step. Also looking at, are there any new major stressors? So I had a fellow say to me once, like, I'm not seeing any changes, and he was training for anxiety. And I said to him, as I go through my like questions I go through in doing this detective work, and I said, well, what if anything is new and stressful in your life? And he said, oh, I just found out a couple of weeks ago, I'm most likely going to lose my job. And I was like, okay, well, that is going to send what was here, right, on our anxiety scale up to here, right? So the noise is louder. It's going to be hard to see the changes from NeurOptimal when you have a very recent stressor, major stressor. But the list of things that I have people look into are, what are your sleep habits? What are your dietary habits? when was the last time you got a good, full workup, including good blood work? What are your relationships like? Do you have any other like illnesses? And really kind of digging, because something is going on. If you see no change and you're having symptoms, right? There's something going on. So, for some people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, we see that, when they have, and this is a very common thing, is that when we're healing trauma, there's a bearing witness part of it. And so there can be kind of flare-ups of strong emotion, but that's part of the system actually trying to work through, because we're not linear, and this is part of the challenge, is that we all like to think linearly, right? We like to think that if something is positive and beneficial, we're going to see, like, if this is our graph, right, we're going to see a positive linear line of change, right? Gradual, steady improvement. But the brain is actually a nonlinear system, which means it acts more, and when it changes more like the weather, like the seasons, right? So we can get a dump of snow in March, right? Freezing cold temperatures in spring. That doesn't mean that spring is off, right? And we're not moving forward. No, that's actually how a nonlinear system changes. So one of the things I see with anxiety and people who have depression, post-traumatic stress, is there's definitely more like the four seasons quality, and that you can have things arise that are maybe what you were hoping to get rid of. But that doesn't mean that the system isn't working and that change isn't happening. And so with people with PTSD, sometimes what I say to them is like, this might be the time to then go and do some very specific trauma work with a therapist, that it seems like there's a readiness for some bearing witness and working through. So depending on what it is that the person, came with to neurofeedback, I might, sort of send them in different directions in terms of finding out what is going on in the system, right? Because the neurofeedback is giving us information, which is no change, which that sucks. That's not the information we were hoping for, but it is information, and we have to keep pursuing, like, what's going on. There is quite a bit of research using earlier the protocol-based neurofeedback systems with addictions. Particularly, I think there was a fellow at UCLA, did it in conjunction with UCLA using the brain paint system, and that kind of launched, the world of addictions to really connect with neurofeedback. There is somebody doing some research using NeurOptimal for addictions. It's not published yet. And this kind of brings me to the other topic with NeurOptimal, which is that, they went to the FDA specifically asking for NeurOptimal to be designated not as a medical device, but as a general wellness device, because they wanted anybody to have access to their system. They didn't want them to have to go through a healthcare provider, because it's safe and non-invasive. And it took a while, but it was a year ago last October that the FDA gave them the designation of a general wellness device. And so there are people who are using it in the context of doing research and as a sort of a treatment for conditions. But the NeurOptimal system itself, when they talk about it, particularly if you go to the NeurOptimal website, you'll see that there is a lack of information about treatment of disorders, and that's part of the FDA guidelines when you're a general wellness system. However, if you do want to see what research has been done, when you go to the NeurOptimal website, and Sarah and I are going to send out an email afterwards with just some support follow-ups if people have them, but we'll include this. you'll get a pop-up window that says, what country are you in? If you click on international, then you can see all the research, because Europe and other countries don't have the same restrictions in terms of what NeurOptimal can put on their website. So you can have access to the actual research that's been done using the NeurOptimal system with various conditions. But I find, going back to addictions, my personal experience of working with clients who have addictions and are using NeurOptimal is that it's so helpful in helping them stay regulated so that they can change their behavior. And if they're working a 12-step program, work that program. Because one of the biggest obstacles to addiction recovery is that it's usually there's not just an addiction, right? There's usually trauma. And trauma leads to substance use to try to re-regulate the system, right? So what can happen for people who are in recovery is then the trauma is there, right? And so they can be triggered, go up into that activated fight, flight, anxious, or down in that depressive response, right? And then get derailed and then want to use substances again to re-regulate themselves, to come back into that zone of feeling safe and secure in the world. So what the NeurOptimal piece does is it helps their brain register safety, stay more regulated, right? Not so much of that fight, flight, freeze, so that they can then do the trauma work, they can work their 12-step program, and they're less triggered, right? They don't go as high into that rage response, right? When somebody says that triggering thing, or as low into that freeze response, right? The hopeless, helpless response. So then people can stay responsive and work their program, or whatever their program is for recovery. So that's my just my anecdotal observations about what happens with addictions. But the main difference is that the expertise is taken from the external trainer. So the older systems are the protocol systems, where you need a diagnosis or you need a brain map. The trainer reads that and goes, your alpha is way too high. You got not enough beta. All right, I'm going to train and migrate through feedback, giving your brain feedback so that it comes into what we consider more of a normal brain pattern, right? And so they're kind of nudging the system. So you can get some, temporary side effects when you have the protocol systems, but they're very effective, and especially when you have someone who's doing it a long time. So there's really no problem with protocol-based systems. But the NeurOptimal system, the big shift that happened was, the design of the system is giving that real-time feedback. So the trainer does not need to be the expert. The expert is the individual's own brain. And the theory is, if you give real-time feedback to the brain, it knows what to do with it to then apply the principles of neuroplasticity and rewire itself. And the most dramatic condition I see this with are head injuries. You give a head injury patient NeurOptimal sessions, and boy, do they change quickly. Because those brains, right, what happens is the trauma happens, the brain goes into its immediate response pattern, and then it stays kind of habituated to that. And so what we're doing is we're saying, hey, brain, you're not finished your work yet. Pay attention to what you see. Pay attention, pay attention. The brain's like, oh my goodness, I'm going to keep working here. I'm not done, right? So then sleep re-regulates, right? Sensory, overload diminishes, ability to focus increases, yada, yada, yada. So the big difference with NeurOptimal is the expertise is in the individual brain. It is purely a feedback system. Interruptions in music, millisecond by millisecond, when there is state change. It is global functioning focused. So it doesn't matter if you have ADHD or you actually have trauma or you have anxiety, but you also have insomnia. It doesn't matter. All of the maladaptive patterns of the brain are shown to that brain in real time. So you don't have to try to figure out, should I do the protocols first for insomnia and then do the depression, or should I start with the depression and then do the insomnia, which is kind of a challenge, and that's people who are really experts know what order to do them. But that's one of the big differences with the neurooptimal system is it shows the brain everything that it's doing. So it doesn't pick and choose. And so the individual brain is the expertise. It's in real time. It's non-invasive. And it's not really by number of sessions as it really is the individual tracking their own progress and seeing the shifts in whatever they wanted to see, right? And then deciding to either keep training or to stop training. It's really the user's choice. There isn't an external decider who tells you how many sessions you do. We have tons of information on our website. And so we'll send out maybe some blogs or things people can read more about to follow up. But of course, you're welcome to email us or call us individually, and we're more than happy to answer questions. So I see someone has a question about borderline personality disorder. Again, to just think more like in terms of like borderline personality has a lot is merged with trauma, right? There's no borderline personality without trauma. What is trauma? Trauma is stuck in those dysregulated stress response patterns. So, neurofeedback, neurooptimal would be a very helpful support for somebody with borderline personality disorder, along with, DBT therapy. That's a really great treatment modality for borderline personality. So, I guess the thing I would say is to really think about neurofeedback as the brain health part of a big picture, right? So the brain gets stuck in patterns. That's how we get a lot of our symptoms. So we're helping that brain register when it's stuck in patterns that aren't appropriate for the here and now. And so that there are lots of things we do to help re-regulate ourselves, and knowing that neurooptimal is one piece, and specifically what it's really great for is anything that has to do with the stress response or parts of the brain that are the automatic functioning brain. Because, impulse control, hyperactivity, anxiety, depression, all those things, that's the automatic functioning brain happening. That's not our willful, selves. So we're really giving that part of ourselves the support with neurooptimal. So thank you everybody for coming. And I hope you all have a good Friday. It is Friday. I always forget what day it is these days. And again, please feel free to follow up personally if you have specific questions we didn't answer. Both Sarah and I are available. And we'll send out a follow-up email.